The morning of 16 March 218 C dawned over Syria with a heavy desert wind, carrying the smell of incense, dust, and political tension that would soon shake the entire Roman world. At the military camp near Raphania, soldiers of the 3rd Gallic Legion gathered in an uneasy silence, unaware that within hours they would be presenting the Roman Empire with one of the most shocking rulers in world history, a 14-year-old boy priest raised among the exotic rituals of Syrian temple, adored as a living embodiment of a foreign goddess, and destined to become emperor under the name that would later terrify historians, Elagabalus. This day marked the beginning of one of the most controversial reigns in ancient Rome, a period of extreme transformation, public scandal, and cultural collision that would push the empire to its psychological limits. To understand why this day felt so unreal to Roman soldiers, one must go back to the unusual world that shaped this boy emperor. Born in the city of Emesa in 203 C, the child, originally named Varius Avitus Bassianus, belonged to a powerful Syrian priestly family. His lineage connected him directly to the cult of Elagabal, the blazing sun deity worshipped through sacred dances, vibrant colors, perfumes, and rituals unfamiliar, and even repulsive, to the traditional Roman mind. From a very young age, the boy was placed at the center of this religious world. Draped in silk robes, adorned with makeup, wearing elaborate jewelry, and trained in ceremonial dances, he grew up performing as the high priest of a goddess that demanded beauty, softness, and femininity from her servants. Those close to him wrote later that he did not merely perform these roles but embrace them intimately, expressing himself in ways the ancient world rarely documented. He preferred feminine clothing, often referred to himself as a bride rather than a ruler, and privately voiced dreams of bodily transformation that modern historians interpret as among the earliest recorded expressions of gender variance. Yet Roman politics had no patience for cultural complexity. What placed this boy on the throne was not his identity alone, it was the raw power of his grandmother, Julia Maesa. She was a sharp, calculating woman of the Severan dynasty, sister of Julia Domna and aunt of the late Emperor Caracalla. After Caracalla's assassination in 217 C, the throne had fallen to Macrinus, a former praetorian prefect with no imperial blood. Many elites despised him, and Maesa saw her chance. She crafted a rumor that the young priest was actually Caracalla's secret son, a claim historically doubtful but convincing enough for legions eager to restore the Severan bloodline. Soldiers stationed in Syria were already disillusioned with Macrinus, whose attempts to cut military spending backfired badly. Morale sank, and Maesa knew exactly how to exploit it. On that fateful morning, Maesa and her daughters brought the boy before the soldiers. He appeared not as a military commander, but as a radiant priest, wearing makeup, violet robes, and the traditional jeweled headdress of the goddess he served. For the Romans, the sight was shocking, but the claim of imperial blood stirred loyalty. As drums beat and incense rose, the young priest raised his arms and invoked not Rome's gods, but the blazing divinity of Emesa. The soldiers, mesmerized by the spectacle and thrilled by the promise of increased pay, raised their shields and hailed him emperor. Within hours, Macrinus fled, and the adolescent priest prepared to take control of the most powerful empire on earth. The new emperor arrived in Rome in the summer of 219 CE, and nothing in Roman history had prepared the city for what was coming. Romans expected new rulers to show strength, discipline, and respect for their traditions. Instead, they watched their emperor transform the imperial palace into a temple of foreign rituals. The boy appeared in public wearing elaborate makeup, embroidered gowns, and wigs styled after his goddess. He rejected the masculine image of emperors before him and publicly surrounded himself with dancers, eunuchs, and performers. Senate meetings became unpredictable, as he often arrived wearing silk robes and golden jewelry instead of the military armor expected of a Roman leader. Many Romans whispered that he seemed determined not to resemble a man at all. Some ancient writers even say he asked doctors whether they could perform a permanent physical transformation, something unheard of in antiquity. Yet, despite Roman discomfort, he was not merely acting out of rebellion. His entire life had been shaped by a spiritual world where femininity was not shameful but sacred, where priests could embody divine qualities regardless of gender, and where ritual beauty symbolized cosmic order. What seemed outrageous to Rome was normal to him, but the Roman establishment perceived these acts not as religious devotion, but as a direct threat to their identity. His religious agenda sparked even greater conflict. The emperor attempted to elevate the Syrian sun god, Elagabal, above Jupiter himself. He transported the sacred black stone of Emesa to Rome, erecting a lavish temple on the Palatine Hill. There, he insisted on performing erotic, music-filled ceremonies that shocked conservative senators. During public festivals, he danced through the streets wearing jeweled robes, surrounded by acrobats and musicians. For him, these were acts of worship. To Rome's elite, they were humiliating. As months passed, his personal life became the subject of intense gossip. He married multiple times in quick succession, including a celebrated Roman noblewoman and, most controversially, a Vestal virgin named Aquilia Severa. Romans believed such a union would bring divine punishment, but he declared that their marriage symbolized the joining of the sun god and Rome's sacred hearth. Behind palace walls, he favored male partners, one of whom, named Hierocles, he introduced publicly as his husband. He often referred to himself as Hierocles' wife. He joked about preparing a dowry for himself, and in private audiences, he sometimes asked guests to call him a lady instead of a lord. These details were recorded with disdain by ancient authors, but modern scholars interpret them as authentic expressions of gender identity in a world with no vocabulary for it. Even within the palace, reactions were complex. Some members of the Severan family were horrified and feared for their political safety. Others tolerated him out of loyalty or ambition. But to Rome's military and political elites, the emperor's behavior symbolized everything they feared: foreign influence, gender nonconformity, and religious chaos. Yet despite the growing scandal, the emperor was not merely indulging in extravagance. He attempted to restructure religious life across the empire, promoting equality between local gods and Roman deities. He introduced festivals meant to unite cultures. He made efforts to blend Syrian and Roman traditions. But his methods were too aggressive, too theatrical, and too unfamiliar for Rome to accept. By the end of his first year, the city murmured with unrest. Senators whispered behind marble columns. Soldiers grumbled in their barracks. Even some of his own advisers began to view him as unpredictable. Yet the emperor continued undeterred, seeing himself not as a disruptor, but as a divine vessel. The winter of 220 CE settled over Rome like a grey shroud. But inside the imperial palace on the Palatine Hill, life was anything but cold or still. There, behind guarded marble corridors, the 14-year-old emperor who had stunned the empire with his arrival was now transforming the palace into a world that blended Syrian mysticism, theatrical performance, and personal identity in ways Rome had never witnessed. Senators whispered in outrage, soldiers gossiped in disbelief, and ordinary citizens told wild stories about their ruler, as if he were a living myth. Yet to the emperor himself, every action, every ritual, and every choice was simply an expression of the life he believed he had been born to live. The emperor's days followed a rhythm unfamiliar to Roman tradition. Rather than holding war councils or reviewing troops at dawn, he began his mornings in perfumed chambers decorated with silks imported from Emesa. Musicians played soft flutes, eunuchs adjusted his robes, and attendants painted his eyes with dark kohl. the same ceremonial style used in the Syrian sun cult. He declared each morning that appearance was a reflection of divinity, that beauty served the gods, and that the empire should witness its leader in full splendor. To the Roman military establishment, this was an outrage. To him, it was devotion. At the center of his spiritual world was the sacred black stone of the sun deity, installed in the newly built temple known as the Elagabalium. Each evening, he ordered a grand procession from the palace to the temple. Dancing priests carried torches, acrobats spun through the streets, and the emperor led the parade in a chariot drawn not by horses but by rare animals, sometimes white camels from Syria. Dressed in jeweled gowns, his face glowing with cosmetics, he guided the procession as if conducting a divine spectacle. Romans watched in stunned silence as the emperor performed rituals that blended masculine and feminine symbols with total confidence. But his religious ambitions grew even more daring. At the height of his reign, he proclaimed that the sun god must be placed above all Roman gods, even Jupiter. For Romans, this was not just heresy. It was a threat to the very order of the world. The temple of Jupiter had stood as the spiritual heart of Rome for centuries. To elevate a foreign deity above him felt like an act of betrayal. Senators who had tolerated the emperor's eccentricities now felt wounded at their core. Yet the emperor did not see himself as a rebel. In his mind, the sun ruled all creation. He believed he had been chosen to unite Rome under the brilliance of the Eastern divinity. He reorganized public sacrifices, demanded new festivals, and introduced a calendar based on Syrian sacred days. Priests accustomed to simple Roman rituals now found themselves learning new dances, burning exotic perfumes, and chanting songs in Aramaic. Some complied reluctantly. Others whispered that the empire had fallen under the spell of foreign magic. As his religious changes intensified, his personal life became the subject of even more fascination. Rome buzzed with stories of the emperor's marriages. His union with Aquilia Severa, a Vestal virgin, remained the most controversial. Vestals were sworn to 30 years of chastity, believed to safeguard Rome's eternal fire. For an emperor to marry one was seen as deeply dangerous, but the emperor insisted the marriage symbolized a cosmic union between his sun god and Rome's sacred hearth. He even declared that the gods had approved the match, but many saw it as a deliberate violation of the most sacred Roman law. Superstitious citizens feared plagues, earthquakes, or military disasters as divine punishment. Senators debated secretly whether this was grounds to remove him from power. His other marriages were equally dramatic. He married and divorced multiple women within short spans, often claiming divine visions guided his decisions. Yet despite these marriages, his deepest affection lay with his male partners. Among them, one man stood out above the rest, Hierocles, a former charioteer from Caria. Hierocles was rugged, muscular, and fiercely protective of the emperor. Ancient sources record moments where the emperor referred to himself as Hierocles' wife, proudly telling attendants that he had finally found a husband. He even requested to be called the Empress of the Palace when Hierocles was present. This dynamic bewildered the Roman elite. For them, the emperor represented the pinnacle of Roman masculinity. To see him embrace femininity, publicly call himself a bride, and celebrate relationships that defied all Roman norms was more than scandalous. It threatened their cultural foundation, but within the palace walls, the emperor's identity shaped daily life. He ordered rooms to be redesigned with soft drapes, luxurious cushions, and flowing fabrics to resemble the Syrian temples of his childhood. He surrounded himself with dancers, makeup artists, eunuchs, and performers who created an atmosphere of sensual celebration. Banquets turned into elaborate theatrical performances where guests sat among fountains of perfume. Servers wore ornate jewelry, and musicians played throughout the night. Romans later exaggerated these events into wild accusations, claiming he turned the palace into an orgy. While many of these claims were moralistic exaggerations by hostile historians, it is clear that he embraced a lifestyle of ritual beauty and intimate expression that shocked traditional Roman sensibilities. One of the most notorious stories recorded by ancient writers involved his fascination with transforming his appearance. He is said to have offered large sums of money to physicians who claimed they could alter his body to match the identity he felt within. He allegedly asked senators to address him as a lady and spoke openly of wanting to be called an emperor's bride rather than an emperor himself. Though some of these accounts come from hostile sources eager to slander him, they reveal that he expressed feelings about his gender with a clarity unusual for ancient records. Meanwhile, political tensions grew. The Praetorian Guard, who had initially accepted him because of their loyalty to the Severan family, became increasingly uncomfortable. They complained privately that the emperor spent resources on ceremonies instead of fortifications, on perfumes instead of weapons. They whispered that Rome had lost its military edge and feared invading tribes might exploit the emperor's lack of interest in warfare. Senators, too, felt pushed to the edge. Many belonged to old Roman families that saw themselves as guardians of tradition. For them, watching the emperor dress in feminine garments, perform dances in public, and elevate a foreign deity felt humiliating. Some believed he was cursing Rome with chaos. Others feared the influence of his grandmother Julia Maesa and mother Julia Soaemias, who held enormous political power behind the scenes. The more the emperor asserted his identity and religious agenda, the more the Roman establishment recoiled. Yet not everything he did was met with anger. Among ordinary people, some admired his generosity. He hosted massive public feasts, gave money to the poor, and opened the palace gardens for celebrations. Children adored his colorful parades. Merchants profited from his passion for luxury goods. Foreign communities in Rome felt seen and respected for the first time. But the delicate balance between admiration and resentment could not last. As the emperor pushed further into cultural transformation, resistance hardened. The Praetorian Guard murmured openly that Rome needed a more stable leader. Senators plotted in secret. Even within the Severan family, his young cousin Alexianus, later known as Severus Alexander, was quietly being positioned as a possible replacement. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine the fate of the empire, the emperor, and the Severan dynasty itself. By the middle of the 1st century BC, during the turbulent decades that would eventually usher Egypt into Roman control, the hidden lives of the boy concubines became even more deeply intertwined with the political instability of the Ptolemaic state. The palace in Alexandria had long ceased to be a purely Egyptian center of power. It had transformed into a melting pot of Greek luxury, Egyptian tradition, and foreign intrigue. Behind its marble walls, the boys who lived as private attendants were silent witnesses to the dangerous dance between royal desires and political survival. These boys did not merely decorate the corridors of power. They became, unwillingly, part of the machinery that sustained the ruler's emotional world. When political alliances crumbled, when rebellions threatened the throne, when sibling rivalries among the royals escalated into open conflict, the king often retreated deeper into the privacy of his chambers. Here, surrounded by carefully controlled attendants, he could maintain an illusion of dominance and stability he no longer possessed in the public realm. The boys became symbols of a ruler's absolute ability to control those closest to him, even as he failed to control the kingdom beyond the palace walls. Within these private wings, routines continued like clockwork. At sunset, the boys lit oil lamps crafted from bronze and alabaster. The fragrant smoke of resin drifted through the halls, masking the scent of sweat and anxiety that defined court life. Musicians played softly for the king's entertainment, while the boys moved with practiced precision, serving food, arranging textiles, and maintaining silence unless spoken to. At night, when the palace exterior fell quiet, the private quarters remained restless, echoing with the hushed movements of attendants fulfilling tasks that were never recorded in official histories. One of the most revealing aspects of this hidden world was the culture of surveillance. The eunuchs who oversaw the boys watched them relentlessly. They ensured that no conversations occurred without permission, no information slipped from tongue to ear, and no alliances formed that could threaten palace secrecy. The eunuchs recorded infractions, punished disobedience, and occasionally removed boys who displayed defiance or distress. Their authority was absolute, their loyalty to the pharaoh was unwavering, and their power became one of the most feared forces within the palace. For the boys, this surveillance created an atmosphere of constant pressure. Even when performing simple tasks like pouring wine or arranging flowers, they felt the gaze of their overseers. They learned to read the slightest change in tone, the smallest gesture of the king, and the hidden signals of the eunuchs. Their survival depended on anticipation. One wrong movement could result in punishment or removal from service. Their lives were shaped by fear, obedience, and the desire to remain invisible when necessary and perfectly present when summoned. But amidst this strict control, the boys developed subtle methods of emotional survival. They formed quiet connections with one another through shared looks, whispered conversations late at night, and gestures of support offered when supervisors were absent. These relationships provided comfort but also carried risks. The eunuchs understood that emotional bonds could lead to alliances, and alliances threatened the secrecy of the palace. Still, the boys clung to whatever small fragments of companionship they could find in a world designed to isolate them. While direct historical accounts rarely mention these boys by name, scattered references across Greek and Roman writings, along with Egyptian administrative fragments, build a picture of their existence. The Greek historian Plutarch, writing about the final years of the Ptolemies, described the lavishness of the royal household and the dangerous indulgences of monarchs who lived far removed from the suffering of ordinary Egyptians. Although he did not explicitly describe the boys, his descriptions of palace luxury align with the environment in which these concubines lived. Extravagance, secrecy, and moral decline were recurring themes in accounts of late Ptolemaic Egypt. Archaeological evidence also hints at the presence of young foreign slaves in royal households. Records from temple archives mention boys purchased from market routes stretching from Nubia to Syria. They were listed as attendants, property of the palace, or members of the Pera. Their roles were categorized ambiguously, but their placement in the palace suggests a system where the vulnerable were absorbed into the royal sphere, not just for labor, but for personal use. One of the most unsettling implications of this system lies in the way these boys were selected. Foreign traders often targeted children who were alone, orphaned, or captured during conflicts. These children had no families powerful enough to challenge their sale. When the boys entered the palace, their past identities disappeared. They were renamed, clothed, and trained to embody the silent elegance expected by the king. Their disappearance from the outside world was total. To those who once knew them, they were simply gone. Inside the palace, the division between the public and private lives of the king grew increasingly stark. When the pharaoh appeared in public, he was depicted as a divine leader guiding Egypt toward stability. He oversaw religious festivals, military parades, and offerings to temple gods. But when he retreated to his private quarters, he entered a realm ruled by emotion rather than political strategy. The boys served as companions during these retreats, offering comfort in forms that are documented only through indirect hints and historical inference. The psychological effects on these boys were profound. Raised in captivity, forced into adulthood prematurely, and living lives shaped by fear and duty, many developed deep emotional scars. Yet the palace rarely considered their well-being. They were viewed not as individuals but as roles to be performed, bodies to be positioned, and voices to be controlled. Their suffering remained hidden behind painted walls and embroidered curtains. Some boys, when they grew older, attempted to navigate the court beyond the private wing. A few succeeded. They became trusted servants, scribes, or minor officials. Their knowledge of palace secrets made them valuable yet dangerous. The king might reward them for loyalty, but kept them under watch for life. Others were dismissed quietly, sent away with the understanding that silence was the price of freedom. Even in freedom, the trauma of their past followed them. Some are believed to have settled in distant towns under new identities, living out their days in anonymity while carrying memories they could never share. The existence of these concubines did not simply reflect the personal indulgences of rulers. It shaped the perception of Egyptian monarchy across the ancient world. Greek and Roman envoys often returned from Alexandria with stories of the palace's extravagant hidden customs. These stories, whether exaggerated or accurate, contributed to the image of Egypt as a land both intriguing and morally weakened. Such narratives were later used by Roman propagandists to justify political intervention, arguing that Egypt had become too decadent to govern itself effectively. As Egypt descended further into political chaos, the palace grew more isolated. Rival factions within the royal family fought openly for the throne. Cleopatra herself inherited a kingdom already fractured by internal conflict, economic troubles, and a court infamous for secrecy. Even though Cleopatra's direct involvement in the lives of boy concubines remains undetermined, she ruled from within a system that had normalized such hidden practices for generations. The boys continued to live in the quiet chambers of the palace, serving roles shaped by tradition and exploitation. They watched from the shadows as the kingdom spiraled toward its final confrontation with Rome. They witnessed royal arguments, betrayals, and the emotional collapse of leaders who struggled to maintain control. They were present when alliances were forged, when foreign envoys arrived, when the queen argued with her brothers, and when the palace doors shut in preparation for war. Yet their presence never appeared in official accounts. They were ghosts in the fabric of history, part of the palace's daily life yet absent from its narrative. Their stories survived only in traces, whispered through archives and foreign writings that hint at a world deliberately concealed. By the final years of the Ptolemaic kingdom, as Cleopatra Roman VII struggled to preserve Egypt's independence against the rising power of Rome, the palace in Alexandria became a fortress of secrecy. Behind its vast courtyards, its Greek-styled colonnades, and its celebrated library stood a world almost invisible to the scholars, generals, and diplomats who walked its halls. It was in these sealed wings, guarded night and day, that Egypt's boy concubines lived out their silent destinies. They were both witnesses and victims of an era defined by political desperation, royal indulgence, and the slow disintegration of a once powerful civilization. The final decades of pharaonic rule revealed how deeply ingrained the system of hidden attendants had become within the royal household. The boys who served in the private chambers represented a centuries old tradition shaped through layers of Egyptian, Persian, and Greek influence. Their presence spoke not only to royal desires, but to the political realities of a monarchy that relied on silence and loyalty above all else. In these final years, the secrecy surrounding them grew even more intense. As Rome's influence crept closer and Cleopatra's rivals stirred rebellion, palace officials tightened their control over every person who lived within its walls. And no group was more closely monitored than the young attendants who served in the innermost quarters. The boys' daily routines remained largely unchanged. They continued to rise before dawn, perform ceremonial grooming, and prepare the private rooms with incense, scented oils, and soft textiles. But the atmosphere grew heavier. Fear seeped into every corner of the palace. The eunuchs who managed the boys became more aggressive, constantly reminding them that the smallest mistake could endanger the entire palace's security. Even a misplaced word could be interpreted as treason. The boys, some as young as 11, lived in a constant state of vigilance. During Cleopatra's reign, the palace was a swirling center of diplomatic activity. Envoys from Rome, Judea, and neighboring kingdoms passed through to negotiate alliances or deliver threats. The boys saw them from afar, hidden behind screens, or stationed silently in the corners of reception rooms. Though they never participated in political discussions, they absorbed the tension, the urgent whispers, and the shifting expressions of those who shaped the fate of the ancient world. These boys understood more about the state of the kingdom than many government administrators. They were observers in positions no historian could ever reproduce. It is during these volatile years that their presence became even more politically significant. Foreign powers, aware of Egypt's internal weaknesses, often used palace gossip to undermine the monarchy. Thus, controlling the flow of information became as important as controlling the army. The boys were forced into tighter silence than ever before. Guards shadowed their movements. Eunuchs interrogated them if they lingered too long in a corridor. Their world shrank further as the palace prepared for war, diplomacy, and survival. Yet even in this climate, the boys continued to serve roles that extended beyond mere attendance. They provided familiarity and stability for rulers who felt their power slipping. Cleopatra, despite her reputation as a political genius, lived with tremendous pressure. Her alliances with Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony shaped global politics, but inside the palace she faced loneliness, betrayal, and the knowledge that she ruled a kingdom whose foundations were cracking. The boys who attended her private wing provided the quiet routine that the rest of the world denied her. Their presence did not imply wrongdoing on her part, but it reflected the royal custom that had existed long before her birth and continued through her reign. When political tensions escalated into open conflict with Rome, the palace atmosphere shifted dramatically. Julius Caesar's arrival in Alexandria during the civil war between Cleopatra and her brother Ptolemy Roman XIII brought violent battles to the city streets. Fires raged, soldiers marched through marketplaces, and citizens fled in terror. Inside the palace, the boys were locked in their chambers for days at a time. They listened to the sounds of war beyond the walls, unsure whether the palace would survive the night. Their overseers provided little information, fearing panic. The boys could only wait and wonder whether their lives would end before they reached adulthood. After Caesar's victory and subsequent departure, Cleopatra rebuilt the palace's routines, but the hidden world of the concubines did not return to its previous calm. Palace restructuring brought new eunuchs, new officials, and stricter surveillance. Cleopatra's later alliance with Mark Antony strengthened Egypt temporarily, but it also drew the scrutiny of Rome more intensely than ever. The palace once again became a center of whispered conspiracy, diplomatic tension, and concealed preparations. The boys, though sheltered from public activity, lived at the heart of these stormy years. When Octavian's forces prepared for war, the tension in the palace became unbearable. Cleopatra and Antony sent troops to defend Egypt, but the palace itself was captured by fear. During these final days, the hidden attendants were instructed to remain constantly ready, their duties unpredictable as the queen's emotional state fluctuated between determination and despair. Some of the boys were reassigned to tasks outside the private chambers to assist palace staff overwhelmed by preparations for war. Others remained isolated, trapped in routines that seemed eerily calm compared to the chaos descending on the kingdom. The Battle of Actium in 31 BC, which sealed Egypt's fate, also sealed the fate of the boys whose lives depended entirely on the existence of the Ptolemaic court. When Antony and Cleopatra returned to Egypt defeated, the palace darkened. Many officials fled, fearing Roman retribution. Eunuchs destroyed documents, burned personal records, and hid sensitive materials that could be used against the palace. Among the destroyed items were lists of attendants, including the names of young concubines. Their identities, already fragile, disappeared even further into the shadows of history. As Octavian's forces marched into Alexandria the following year, panic spread through the royal household. The boys were evacuated from their chambers, some relocated deeper into the palace, others hidden among the servants. Roman soldiers searched the palace not only for royal treasures, but for symbolic evidence of Ptolemaic decadence. The eunuchs, desperate to protect the boys from being taken as trophies or slaves of war, dispersed them quietly. A handful escaped into the streets, blending into the chaos of a dying kingdom. Others were absorbed into Roman households as servants. A few vanished completely, their stories ending in disappearance. Cleopatra's death marked the end of more than a dynasty. It ended a world of palace customs that had existed for centuries, including the hidden system of young attendants. Rome systematically dismantled the structures of the Egyptian monarchy. The palaces were emptied, treasures catalogued, and private quarters sealed off. The boys who once served in these chambers no longer had a place in Roman governance. Their fates diverged. Some were enslaved, some became household servants in Roman estates, and a rare few may have found freedom as common workers in Alexandria or the countryside. Their past lives remained secrets they could never reveal. Their existence left no statues, no inscriptions, no scrolls dedicated to their experiences. Yet their silent presence shaped the atmosphere of the royal household, revealing the contradictions between public power and private vulnerability. They were victims of empire, symbols of the personal indulgences of rulers, and unseen participants in events that changed world history. The story of Egypt's boy concubines illuminates a darker truth about ancient civilizations. Behind every monument, every triumphal inscription, and every royal procession lay individuals whose suffering was hidden beneath the glitter of empire. These boys existed because power allowed rulers to reshape human lives to fit their desires and preserve their authority. The decline of Egypt mirrors the decline of their world, both fading into silence as new rulers ascended. The fall of the Ptolemaic kingdom did not erase the memory of what had existed. It simply buried it under layers of political propaganda, cultural bias, and deliberate erasure.